College football nerds here a day late because I was sick to talk Alabama and Auburn. The Iron Bowl every year is really big. This year is no different. Want to obviously remind y'all, please like and subscribe. It helps us out so much, especially also if you comment below, which I want you to do. Comment below and let us know what you think the score is going to be and how much all these injuries are going to impact that score. And finally, want to remind y'all that we have an audio version of this show. It's on iTunes, it's on Android, so we try to get it out either same day or next day. So either Tuesday or Wednesday, you'll be able to find the audio-only version. We also post it on the website for you people who don't want to listen on YouTube. All right, Josh, I'm going to do it a little different this week because there's so many questions around the injury situation for Alabama and how it compares this Alabama team, who they are now, which matters, versus how they were before with Tua and not as many injuries, which maybe doesn't matter. And I want to, we usually kind of talk it up a little bit, talk about the game and the matchups, and then get into the model. I want to get into the model right now to look at, because our model sort of has the whole year's numbers, look at how the advanced numbers, the stats, see these two teams before injury, and then we can unpack that. So why don't we go straight in the model and talk about it, and then we'll go from there.
Our model does not take injuries into account, and essentially any statistical model isn't going to. There are some that will try to take returning production into account in the preseason. Very little, if anybody, actually takes this kind of stuff into account during the season. The reason for that being, you can't really predict what a replacement player is going to do relative to the player that were in front of them. You don't know how much the drop-off is going to be. You can kind of guess based on recruiting rankings. Ours doesn't use recruiting rankings and that kind of stuff. It's entirely based off performance on the field. We've talked about that quite a bit. Our model, again, per play, meaning it's per play because it's looking at the plays you did. It's looking at your actual performance against opponents. It's looking at their actual performance this season against other teams they played. Building a scoring model that's based on your performance on the field this year, and the scoring model is unique for each team based on that. The problem is our model, by and large, is based on the idea that Tua Tagovailoa is the starter for Alabama. There's not much I can do to change that. We can have a discussion later, but this is the model if Tua was going to play in this game. And no, the Mississippi State game, the game was too easy for it to really matter. It doesn't skew the model sort of to compensate in any way for it. Our model thinks, unsurprisingly, both teams have pretty good defenses. Auburn's defense a little better than Alabama's. It doesn't think Alabama's going to be able to run the ball in this game. Has them for about 3.5 yards per carry. It does think Alabama would be able to pass, about 8.2 yards per attempt. The problem is Auburn is expected to get about 4.1 yards per carry, which is actually pretty good on the ground. 4.1 yards per carry is not bad, but 5.7 yards per attempt. That's a miserable number throwing the football. I think it's interesting when we talk about the absence of Tua. In the model, it may be that Alabama doesn't hit those numbers, but there's no reason to think that the numbers for Auburn would necessarily be that far off if it wasn't for the fact that Alabama also has a lot of defensive injuries, which is something we'll get into later. So otherwise, at least I'd think that Auburn number is correct, but maybe it's not either. Based on that kind of production, it figures Alabama will outgain Auburn by somewhere between a half yard to a yard per play. 37 points to 21.4. Actually, we're right at a half yard, a little more than that. 37 to 21, Alabama over Auburn is the guess, but 37-21, 16-point win, and Vegas has this a 3-point game. So that tells you how much the injury situation matters. Both, one, Mac Jones at quarterback instead of Tua Tagovailoa, but I think almost equally important, and we'll touch on this at the end, maybe is the defensive injuries for Alabama in the short term. Both those things are going to compound to give you an idea of where this game should be and why the current spread is 3 points when our model, which is usually pretty tight to Vegas. Again, we had Auburn, Georgia, a 2020 game in our model. When we've been, I think, fairly accurate. The Auburn-Florida game we had as tight as it was. That could have swung either way. It doesn't think this game should have been close. So why is it close in Vegas' eyes?
So we'll get into defense in a minute, but obviously we want to talk about quarterback first. And I don't know where Auburn fans are at. I don't want to offend them or anything, but if I were betting this game or picking this game a few weeks ago, That 37-21 kind of score feels about right to me. Maybe the score is lower on both sides, but that margin feels about right to me. I think Auburn would score on this defense regardless a little bit, and I think Alabama would benefit from a lot of possessions and score a lot of points. So I don't think that's crazy.
No, and I don't think it is either. So the early line, the early projected line for this game was 14 points, and this week that line came out at -4, -3.5. And to give you an idea, LSU, Texas A&M, the opening line for that game I think was 16 or 17. It was 16 points, and it's moved. Now you can get it 16 or 17 depending on the service and the time. So yeah, that's a tremendous shift, a 10-point shift from what it was projected to be the opening line just a few weeks ago for what it is now. So I think our model is in line with what was expected. But the moment that injury hit, it radically altered the landscape of how this game was seen. Tua is considered to be worth 2 touchdowns in this game.
Yeah, and then you had the defensive injuries. A couple of defensive linemen go down. I think Saban said last week they had 7 guys in mind to start the season in their front 7, and 2 of those guys are currently playing. So that's ridiculous. Okay, so let's talk about quarterback. Mac Jones has put up really good numbers in his 2 starts, but they've been against really bad opponents. And there's a few ways to look at this, but my take on this is we know absolutely nothing. I'm not taking anything from what he did against Arkansas or Western Carolina, and 1 good and 1 bad. And I'll say 1 good and 1 question mark. The good that I took away from, especially watching some of the game last week, as much as one could tolerate Alabama playing Western Carolina, the good from what I saw is that they didn't feel the need to show their offense against Western Carolina. It was like wide receiver screen all day, play action, running a ton of play action. And for me, I think that people don't realize Mac Jones can run the RPO. He can throw that RPO slant all day long. That's part of their offense, and he runs the same offense that Tua ran. So the fact that they trust him to get it done vanilla style with play action, I think they were showing a little something to kind of maybe throw future coaches off guard so that they can pull out the Tua offense when everybody maybe game planning for big, slow, lumbering play action kind of offense. The question mark is, I don't know that we could glean anything from statistically what he did against Arkansas and Western Carolina, good or bad, because a bad quarterback surrounded by elite talent could put up those same numbers.
So the Arkansas game in particular, it's easy to look at that game and say that Mac Jones was very effective, and he was. But just a week prior, Arkansas had played Auburn. And in the Auburn game, Bo Nix goes 13 of 19, 193 yards. It's 10.2 yards per attempt with 4 touchdowns, a 68% completion percentage. Mac Jones was very efficient against Arkansas. He threw for 80% passing. That's actually the highest percentage allowed by Arkansas, despite their issues, better than even Joe Burrow did. But 9.3 yards per attempt, 3 touchdowns. Lower totals than Bo Nix had with even more attempts than Bo Nix. So, like you said, I don't know that there's anything you can really take away from it. I mean, he's being effective, but he's being effective at a rate that's maybe less than Nix is. We've been pretty clear on what our complaints are with Bo Nix. We haven't had a tremendous amount of faith on him the entire season. My point is he was just as effective or more effective against Arkansas than Mac Jones was. I don't know if that means Mac Jones is good or bad. I mean, Mac Jones was also as effective as a lot of other pretty good quarterbacks were. He's certainly more effective, I will say, than like Texas A&M was or Kentucky was. I don't think he's a terrible quarterback, but Ole Miss threw for over 10 yards per attempt too. LSU threw for 11. Beating them in Arkansas isn't necessarily a big data point. I will flip it over and say real quick, maybe the one common opponent data point, and I think this is getting back maybe to the point earlier with the model, and the model being based off old data. There was a gap here between what Alabama had and what Auburn had, and I think that kind of shows in the LSU games. It's easy to look at that LSU score and say these two teams are even because LSU beats Auburn by 3, Alabama loses to LSU by 5. Okay, 3 points, 5 points. What's the difference, right? Well, the difference seems really small when you look at scores, it isn't as insignificant when you look at the base statistics. Now, that isn't to say that LSU somehow beat Auburn worse than they beat Alabama. I mean, the score on the field is what really matters from that context. But when we're trying to pull out numbers to say you're going to do in a future game, the fact that you lost to LSU by 3, or maybe that you beat LSU by getting a busted coverage touchdown at the end of the game, that's actually pretty irrelevant to how you're going to win this game. What we really care about is more the per play stats. It's more your performance on the field. That's the stuff that's actually an indicator for future success when we're doing a projection, a different problem. In those sorts of metrics, there's a pretty big gap between the performance that Alabama had versus LSU had. Alabama was outgained by LSU by just 18 yards, 559 yards to 541. If you include special teams yardage, because they had a long punt return, Alabama actually had more yardage. That's important because Alabama loses a drive by virtue of having a punt return touchdown. In 22 first downs to 29. Alabama actually threw for a higher yard per attempt average than LSU. They rushed for a higher yard per carry average than LSU. Again, their total yardage was only behind it because they were shorted one drive due to the punt return touchdown. Auburn, on the other hand, is the exact opposite story. Only 4.4 yards per attempt in that game. That's miserable. Auburn could not throw the football at all. LSU did 7.6 yards per attempt, 4.1 yard per carry. Auburn was at 3.9 yard per carry. I think it's interesting that LSU was 4.1 yards per carry against Auburn and 4.2 yards per carry against Alabama. Maybe a little bit of an overlooked point that they really weren't any more effective running the football against Alabama than they were Auburn. In fact, you can make the argument perhaps that it might have been a little bit the opposite. Joe Burrow did actually take some sacks in that game against Auburn. Now that's a credit to Auburn in their own way, but I'm saying when you isolate it to the rush offense, LSU was actually a little bit more effective in certain ways. Edwards-Helaire had the same yard per carry average, 5.2 yards per carry against both teams. The difference is Tyrion Price and the rest of the run game, be it Burrow or what have you, really wasn't as effective outside, maybe the sack yardage, which is, I'm just saying that's really a passing stat, not a rushing stat. The biggest difference in those two games was Burrow threw from a lot more effectively in Alabama than they did Auburn. But you can get the point there from that whole story, right? That there are things that look to be obvious, that maybe these two teams are similar in the way those games played out score-wise, but otherwise Alabama had a pretty significant edge. It really all comes down to the fact, how much do you think, for example, the passing game between those two games, Alabama being over 10 yards per attempt, Auburn being 4.5 yards per attempt, is Alabama half the passing game that they were before? Are they somewhere close to that? Are they 75%? That's where you have to draw the line in order to determine where this game should be at in terms of who should be favored. It's a really difficult thing to say, and I can't really argue that we have any clear answer on it.
All right, so we talk about scaling a lot. And just quickly, scaling might mean we've always used the Ohio State JT Barrett offense as an example, but scaling in that Auburn's a good example of this year, where when they can out athlete somebody and they can do things a little bit easily and things happen a certain way in terms of yards per play, the scoring ramps up dramatically. But you have to hit that certain threshold. If not, your scoring falls off dramatically. So let's say Mac Jones is 75% of Tua, which is probably being pretty generous. And he rolls out a respectable 8 yards an attempt against Auburn. That doesn't necessarily mean they score 35, 33 points instead of 41. It might mean they score 17. Because Alabama might need a certain threshold to actually go from having, a nice couple of first downs drive to actually scoring.
Offenses tend to have a certain point at which they need to function. And if you're a pro-style offense and you're a run-first offense, you need to be a pretty high yard per play average because you don't have a ton of explosive plays. This was always the problem for LSU under Les Miles. Their offense needed a really high yard per carry average for them to be effective, because if they weren't getting 6 to 8 yards per carry, any negative play, if you're 5 yards per carry, you think, okay, I can get that in 3 plays. Well, okay, what happens when you get a tackle for loss and you lose 2 yards on first down? Now you got to get 12 yards in 2 plays and you average 5 per play. You can't get 6 yards per play on average, so you tend to end up punting anytime anything goes wrong. You need to be able to exceed whatever you need at a good clip, because sometimes you're going to have an incompletion or something's not going to happen the way you want it to happen, and you got to be able to overcome that. You need to average a good chunk. Explosive plays offset that quite a bit because explosive plays let you score really efficiently. All the yardage you dump into that play tends to get you down the field into scoring position. The better Malzahn offenses have had high scoring efficiency because they have a lot of explosive plays. This particular offense does not have that many. That's kind of the issue with Mac Jones. When you want to compare him to Tua Tagovailoa, he could be at 8.5 yards per attempt rather than 11 or 11.5. The problem is Tua could consistently get a 3rd and 11 if he wanted to. And we saw that a lot in the LSU game. There were some really 3rd and very long opportunities, and they converted on those downs. And a lot of it was due to his ability to anticipate, his ability to drive the ball with tremendous accuracy downfield. If Mac Jones is at like 8.5 yards per attempt, even if he has a couple big bomb shots in the game, that drop off is a lot more significant than I think some people would realize, because Tua was averaging a first down throughout the season. His average throw averaged a first down. And what Mac is basically doing is saying, okay, you throw an incompletion and then you throw a completion. Now you have to have a 3-yard run to top it off. Where Tua, he could throw 3 passes. 2 of them could be incomplete, and the 3rd one would get a first down on its own. And that's the scaling issue. That's the issue where, maybe the yard per play doesn't drop that much, but it really affects the ability for the offense to score points because it affects their ability to move the chains. And it also changes things because everybody that's played Tua has been terrified of the pass. No one is ever going to drop a safety down. And if Auburn is willing to drop a safety down and take 8, they'll be willing to drop a safety down in the box and eat 8.5 yards per attempt because they'll shut down the run game. With Tua, you had to drop the safeties, which means you couldn't ever really possibly stop the run, and the offense worked pretty effectively.
I also want to talk about the scaling on the defensive side, where Auburn's defense is good. It's good against everybody. We know that. That's a known quantity. It's probably why we're talking about Alabama a little bit more, because we know a little bit more about who Auburn is. But against Alabama, a lot of teams, there's been a lot of talk about how Alabama's defense is trash this year. But from what I've seen, it takes an offense that scales against a really good defense to get into that zone of being able to exploit this Alabama defense. And I'm not sure that Auburn can get up to that level with an offense that scales enough to fully exploit the weaknesses for this Alabama defense.
So the next part of your question is, all right, now we've talked about Alabama's offense. What about Auburn's offense? And there's an issue, too, with Auburn. And if Auburn's offense can function at a high enough level to be able to exploit the problems that Alabama has defensively. Alabama's biggest issues defensively really come from the fact that the linebacking position has 2 very unproven players. The defense doesn't really know what they're doing. They give up a lot of easy plays where they miss assignments. And it's not just the linebackers. The amazing thing is, Maiden and Carter, 2 of their secondary players, are constantly, seems like, a little bit confused if they have bunch formations. Maybe that's inside-out calls. I'm not sure what happens. And then it's certainly an issue where they don't have enough pressure and they don't have enough complicated packages available for coverage that they can't keep somebody on their toes, so they're able to exploit it because everything's kind of straightforward. But regardless, they have all this myriad of issues that's been stopping them. And I don't think it's really athletic potential to a large extent. I think it's more just how they're executing or performing defensively. Not shocking when you've got 5 or 6 freshmen starting on your defensive unit. That has only shown up in certain games. I mean, some teams have been able to exploit it. A lot of teams have not. I think it comes down to the execution level of your offense. It comes down to the fact whether you can actually spread somebody wide enough to get Alabama uncomfortable, whether you can have a quarterback that makes good reads quickly. Joe Burrow killed Alabama because when Alabama would bring pressure, when Alabama screwed something up, he would find the open guy in either situation. And I don't know how many times I saw LSU complete a pass. There were a couple of them late in the game where they were like 3rd and 11 and they dump it off to Edwards-Helaire. A couple of them were hot reads, some of them weren't, and then they just got 10 or 12 yards and moved the chains. Those are plays that really shouldn't happen for LSU if Alabama's defense was the defense of old, or if Alabama's defenders just knew what they were doing. But they don't, and that's what Alabama is defensively this year. The problem is Bo Nix a guy that can actually capitalize? So if you want to go back and sort of compare it and see where Auburn sits, in terms of yards per play offensively, your 2 kings of the mountain in the SEC are Alabama and LSU. They sit at 7.95 yards per play. Those are ridiculously absurd offensive numbers. So anything that happened in that LSU game, you kind of have to throw out for everybody else because nobody else can generate that kind of offense. When you step it down, the next teams in that list, actually Mississippi State is number 4. You can talk about whether or not that is actually deserved. I'll say they're actually 5 if you look at FBS only. Ole Miss would be number 4 otherwise. But Tennessee is actually at number 8. Texas A&M's at number 7. Georgia's number 6. Auburn's at number 9. Behind Tennessee, behind Texas A&M, behind Ole Miss, behind Mississippi State. So I think it's a little bit interesting or instructive to see what happened for Alabama when they were playing those teams. Now, Ole Miss was able, I think, to exploit Alabama to a certain extent defensively because they moved the ball at a pretty good clip. Again, outside Alabama and LSU, the next 2 up are Florida and Ole Miss, and those are the best offenses. Ole Miss is the best one that Alabama's faced in the SEC. They're able to move good chunk yardage on Alabama. I don't know that Auburn's offense is, frankly, as good as Ole Miss's this year. I mean, Auburn's defense is tremendously better than Ole Miss's, but Ole Miss's offense has actually been pretty darn solid. They're more comparable, I think, to maybe Texas A&M or Tennessee. Now, Texas A&M was able to move the ball fairly successfully, 5.56 yards per play. That's deceptive because Texas A&M also got a lot of their yards and points late in the game when Alabama was subbing. Tennessee was not effective in that game, 3.8 yards per play. They had some points and a couple quick drives, but they really never sustained it. They only had 231 yards of offense. And the concern is if Auburn really is offensively slightly behind Tennessee, that may be where the scaling issue comes into play. That you may say that they may be, 60 or 70% of the quality of LSU, but they may get 30% of the production. Because to do the things you need to do to make Alabama be exploited, you have to be able to efficiently move the ball and capitalize on matchups. The question is, can Bo Nix do it? I might sort of posit that in an ideal situation, I don't know that Auburn can do it. I think the thing you have to turn to in evaluating this game, and it's the thing we alluded to at the beginning, it's not what Alabama would have been able to do in the past defensively, because I think if they were completely healthy, this game is still probably one-sided. The concern is, can Alabama stop Auburn's running game if their front 4 is badly injured?
And I think it depends on who comes back and who doesn't. It looks like Raekwon Davis, I looked at the practice report today, Raekwon Davis is back, no limitations, but DJ Dale, losing him, if he can't come back, might be huge. That's an interior defensive lineman. I think that they're okay. I think that there's something else that Alabama may have found that we spotted in the LSU game. We went back and reviewed the film on that and noticed that they put Benton in at linebacker in hopes of sort of stemming the tide of people being able to throw against them to the running backs and tight ends and isolate the linebackers. And I think they went with Shane Lee, and said, look, we're going to assume that we might give up 1 or 2 big plays in the passing game, but we're going to at least shore up the run game. And I think that's been hugely successful for them, at least in not being exposed that badly, because be it run or pass, Benton was completely lost, absolutely lost. And I don't want to say worthless, but it was pretty close. I'm going to go ahead and give my pick on this game, and maybe we can talk a little bit after it. I know we've talked a lot about Alabama in this show. Part of it is, like I said, there's just so much unknown for Alabama. The Alabama team that we have now versus the Auburn team that we have now is just they're not only battered, but they're having to play guys that don't have a lot of experience, especially at quarterback. That's a horrible situation to be in. I look at the 5 teams that are around what I think Alabama is defensively with these injuries that Auburn's played this year. And those teams are, hold on, I'm pulling it up. Oregon, A&M, Florida, LSU, and Ole Miss. I didn't include Georgia in there. I think Georgia's a better defense. Auburn averages 21.6 points per game against those teams. Only one of those teams is really good offensively. That's LSU. So I don't think it's out of the question to see Auburn in the 22 to 24 point range. I don't think that's ridiculous. I'm going to go Auburn 24, and I'm going to go Alabama 21. I just don't know about Mac Jones right now. I don't. There's going to be some field goals. Let's go Alabama 24-20. I don't know what to think about Mac Jones. There's so much unknown there. And if he had a medium level start on the road against somebody that had a pulse, like let's say instead of Arkansas, his first ever career start was against Ole Miss, who has a decent defense, and they won easily, I'd feel a lot better about picking Alabama in this game. But he's just a complete question mark going into an extremely hostile environment. So as much as I think that Mac Jones might be good, I don't know. There's no way to know. So if I'm picking something that I'm going to be held accountable for, I trust Bo Nix, who does have experience in pressure situations, even starting from his first start, and does have a really, really good defense as a known quantity backing him up. We don't know in terms of even if these injured guys play, if they're going to be 70%, 100%, whatever. So I've got Auburn 24, Alabama 20. Give me your pick.
So one of the more interesting things I will say for Alabama this year, and we've talked about it, a time or two, Alabama's rush defense is deceptive and confusing. So the first half of games, they're at 2.6 yards per carry. In the second half, they're at 4.86. And when we look at the opponent percentages allowed, that's one of the intermediary statistics our model generates. I didn't really reference it when I was talking about the model because it was kind of saving it for the end, to be honest. Alabama's at 87% of opponent rush averages, 83% of opponent pass. Auburn's at 70% and 77%. One of the takeaways there is these pass defenses are not terribly different. Maybe Auburn's slightly better than Alabama. We're talking 5 or 6% here, so you're kind of within margin of error. The advantage here, and it's fairly significant on paper, is that Auburn is a very good run defense. I wouldn't actually call them elite looking at that number, but I would say very good, where Alabama is just merely pretty good. I mean, they're good, but sub 90% is not overly good. The problem with that is that first half, second half dichotomy. Is the fact that Alabama's given up 913 yards on just 188 carries in the second half and only 500 yards and over 200 carries in the first half. So teams just don't run the ball for nearly as many big plays, the 20 plus yard carries, okay, big run plays. They've given up 3 in the first half and they've given up 13 in the second half. Those are one of the better numbers in the country and one of the worst. That's the depth issue for Alabama. The defensive injuries have really crippled them. But what's worse than that is it means they've started freshmen, and then the backups are guys that they really never wanted to see the field. And that's where the defensive injury question comes in, because the more injured they are, and the more they don't have these guys, even if guys like Raekwon Davis can't start, if he can at least give significant minutes, then it sort of negates the problem, because then they have a true freshman or two that they can play in that spot and be competent. If they got to go further down that depth chart, they're going to start looking pretty shaky pretty quick. I do tend to think Alabama's going to win this game. I'm going to say 27-20 Alabama. And the reason for it is I think they're just healthy enough to hold point on the defensive line. And the other part of it really comes down to where Auburn's rush offense is. So if you look the past few games, obviously they had a good enough game, 300 yards rushing against Samford, but that's Samford. They ran for 2 yards per carry against Georgia. That's excusable. Georgia is a phenomenal defense all around, especially against the run. But they only ran for 3.6 yards per carry against Ole Miss. They ran for 3.9 yards per carry against LSU. Alabama's defense was better than LSU's. I'm not sure it's better now with the current injury situation. I do think Alabama's run defense is probably better than Ole Miss's. The stats bear that out. I mean, if you look at SEC run defense statistics, Alabama is, at least better than Ole Miss. I mean, they're 5th in the conference. Ole Miss is quite a bit further down at 8th. So I think Alabama can be able to stop the run. And if they can stop the run, they don't have major injuries in the secondary. They do have one of the better, if not really the best secondary group in the SEC. LSU is more talented. They have not played more talented, probably due to the lack of pass rush. And that last part's an important part too. Alabama does have a better pass rush than I think they're given credit for. I don't think they're as good as Auburn's unit, but they actually have more sacks than Auburn. In fact, they've got 29 sacks to Auburn's 26. It's a little bit of an edge there. And I think all those components, the sack leaders are all healthy, the secondary is healthy. I think they're going to be able to contain Auburn. All Auburn's going to be able to do is run the ball. They have at no point been able to control a game running the ball. They have to be able to throw if they want to be successful. The run game's just not good enough on its own. I think Alabama can put a guy in the box and be able to stop the run and not give up big plays through the air. I'm a little concerned with Alabama's ability to deal with jet sweeps and motions. They've given up edge containment in a lot of cases this year. But if they get a guy in the box, particularly if they take Xavier McKinney and they start bringing him down on the edge a lot, that's going to help tremendously because he can help with the edge stuff that they're going to want to do with Schwartz and sort of show off the speed that Schwartz or Joyner and all these plays Auburn has. I think that's their best edge in the game. I have Alabama 27-20. I don't know, just like you, if that's really realistic. The reason being I have no idea what kind of production they'll get out of the passing game. But I do think, and I think both of us agree on this, I don't think Auburn is going to really be able to score more than, say, 25 points in the game. The key for Auburn to win this game is they really need to keep Alabama 25 or under. Auburn, in a game this year, you talked about margins and thresholds where things go sideways. Their only really good offensive output in FPS play was Kent State and Arkansas. Those games they needed to be 7-8 yards per play. I'll throw Mississippi State in there. All those were 7 to 8.5 yards per play games. They're not going to get that against Alabama. Everything else, when they were in the 4 to 6 range, the normal offensive output, they've scored max 28 points. So it's just highly unlikely they're going to score 30. They need to hold Alabama under 30 points, ideally hold them under 25. I think if Tua were on the field, that'd be very unlikely, but with Mac Jones, it's definitely a possibility.
I think that there's an opportunity here for Auburn as well in terms of forcing turnovers with a rookie quarterback. I think that might come into play. I think you've also got to look at the punting situation, which is really shaky for Alabama. That might also come into play in giving Auburn some short fields. I also think that So I think Gus has shown, especially in this game, even last year when they were completely outmanned, he could claw together 20 points. I mean, he did it last year against Alabama. Was a healthier team last year, although they had some injuries, like Diggs was out, I think, at this point last year. They had injuries, especially where they couldn't be exploited by Auburn, but obviously by Clemson. I also think back to 2017, where you had an Alabama team that came in with, at this point, Jalen was an okay quarterback, and the defense was completely battered. I think they were down like 5 linebackers or something, and Auburn just power ran them to death, and that game really wasn't even competitive. So maybe that one's sticking in my head a little bit from that point as well. But tell me this. I don't know how much this plays into it, but psychology does matter. Alabama still at this point is considered a playoff team. Whether it's right on the edge or whatever, they're still in the hunt legitimately as a playoff team. 2 things. One, do you think Alabama is going to play this game in a way knowing they need style points to win and that a 21-17 game ain't going to cut it? And 2, if that's the case, could you see this going sideways for Alabama if they get down early?
So I think the answer to that is probably no. I think they're well aware of the fact that they've got a backup quarterback, that this is going to be a difficult game, that they're only favored by 3 points. Maybe they don't look at betting lines, but I have a feeling they know that it's going to be a closely favored game. I think they know they just got to win the game. And in a way, I think that's almost an edge to them, because you pointed this out yourself going into the LSU game. When Alabama gets in these big games and they know they're in a big game and they know they've got to prove themselves, they've come out really flat several times in the past few years. 27 Auburn was one of those games, or 2017 Auburn. They came out in that game and they knew they needed to come in and beat Auburn. It was going to be a very difficult game, and they got to do that to go to the playoff and win the SEC, blah, blah, blah. And they just laid an absolute egg. Auburn came and took it to them the entire game, hammered them on the ground with Kerryon Johnson, and they had no response. I think Alabama knows this is a game that's going to be a hard-fought game for them. I think they know that they're a little bit on the ropes in a lot of ways. I think you are right that the experiment that Alabama ran, and it was a 1-game experiment against LSU where Benton was used in all their dime packages. And as we noticed, because we noticed watching the film that was a thing that they had never done before. And we noticed watching the film the next game because we were curious. Sure enough, he never stepped foot on the field in those packages. So we were absolutely right to think that he was a massive liability because he was totally removed from the formation. I think they all know what they need to do. I think the freshman players know that they've got to step up. I don't expect Alabama to have a major psychological issue in this game. I think Alabama is going to come in ready to play. The question really is going to be whether Auburn can run the ball well enough on Alabama's depleted front to be able to move the chains and get points on the board, or if they can't, because I think if they can't run, the offense is going to shut down. I am more concerned with that matchup than the passing game matchup, because I think even if it doesn't work very well, Alabama has more weapons on the offensive side of the ball. They can score points. I'll say one thing that's probably going to make some Auburn fans mad, but it's realistic and it's true. Alabama probably has an advantage. If you're to match up position unit to position unit offensively, which doesn't really affect a game directly in any way, Alabama has better receivers than Auburn. Alabama's weakness is tight end. Auburn does not have a tight end that's caught more than 3 or 4 passes in the season. Alabama has really good running backs. All the pieces are there on offense, ignoring Mac Jones to be successful. I don't know if Bo Nix or Mac Jones is a wash, but I know the pieces around him are better. So it's unrealistic to think that if Auburn can score points, that Alabama can't. The problem is that obviously Auburn's defensive line is radically better than Alabama's right now. Auburn's linebacker situation is better. Maybe their secondary isn't as good one-on-one, but benefiting from the rush and everything else, I think they're a better unit. It's an interesting and difficult matchup, with the key piece being the ability of the quarterback to make use of that talent advantage that Alabama has at receiver. And unfortunately, that's a piece that we just absolutely know nothing about.
And I'll throw one data point in there that supports your score and not so much my score. Maybe it does. Georgia against Auburn, granted, I think they have a better defense, like I've said, than Alabama, but Georgia needed 3.9 yards per attempt and 110 total yards to score 21 on Auburn. That's atrocious. Like, that is one of the worst quarterback stat lines I've seen in a major game from a winning team this year. That is absolutely atrocious. I can guarantee you Mac Jones will have a better stat line than that. And it's not like DeAndre Swift just went ham. They only ran for 141 yards against Auburn. So there's hope in that for Alabama fans that we've seen. Like, the question is, what if Mac Jones is terrible? Well, Jake Fromm was absolutely terrible. That passing game was absolutely terrible, to Auburn's defensive credit, and they still won that game. So there's that. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for sticking with us. It was a long one, but the Iron Bowl always deserves that much talking. Y'all have a great week. God bless.